morning. My name's Robyn Littleford, and I'm a teacher. I work at GF Strong School Program at GF Strong Rehab Center, and I've been working there for about 30 years with traumatically injured kids. So now I work on a program called the Early Response Concussion Service, and I work with kids with concussion, and so I will be talking today about returning to school following a concussion. So for most kids with a concussion, it takes about 2 to 4 weeks for recovery, but there's a smaller group of kids, about 10 to 15% of kids, that actually will take longer. And these kids may have experienced a previous concussion, they may have pre-existing learning issues, and they may even in fact have a mental health issue. So it can take longer. So it's really, really important to remember that a concussion actually impacts the brain's ability to process information. And kids spend all day engaged in cognitive activity. That can be things like participating in a classroom, completing homework, socializing, or using technology. But everything they do involves the brain. So for any student with a concussion, it's really important to actually develop a school return plan. And this involves a team of people. So the first step is it's really important that a concussion is actually reported to the school. And unfortunately, it does happen where students and their families don't report their concussion to the school, and it's really difficult for a kid with a concussion to actually be sitting in a classroom. A concussion is an invisible injury. There's usually no marker telling you that this child has had this kind of brain injury. So there needs to be planning that occurs around returning a student to school. This is really important. And there's safety issues too, because a student that has one concussion may in fact be more likely to sustain a second concussion while they're actually symptomatic. Every concussion is unique, and that's because every student is unique. And it's also impossible to predict a timeline for recovery. Rushing back to school usually does not work. And in fact, overworking an injured brain can actually exacerbate symptoms. So return to learn plans are a collaborative approach, and they involve the student, the family, and the school. And what we're actually doing in a return to learn plan is that we're actually going to identify a student's specific concussion symptoms, and these would be physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms. And they need to be identified in order to actually create an appropriate plan. So physically, the kinds of things we see would be headaches, fatigue, dizziness and nausea, blurred vision, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, and sleep issues. Cognitively, kids would report poor concentration, poor memory, and difficulty with new learning, and also a reduced speed of information processing. Emotionally, we'd see anxiety and depression, frustration and anger, and irritability. Now, students might have one or two of these symptoms, they may have more than that. So once the symptoms are identified, then we create a plan, and we refer to it as stepwise because it's actually a progression through a number of steps. And the idea is to gradually increase attendance and decrease learning accommodations. And a student's needs are at the center of the planning. So it's really important not to make the symptoms worse. That's sort of the guideline for us. So what we want to consider is the students' courses, their course load, what kind of work that they've missed, how long they've been out of school, what their homework tolerance is, and even the time of year is really important to consider. Now, a discussion around a student going back to elementary school will be different than a student going into high school. High school tends to be a little bit more complex because it involves more teachers, and the workload can be greater. However, it's still the same steps. So what you need to remember is that a school is a noisy and bright environment with lots of social activity. And if a student has issues with noise and light sensitivity, it's a really difficult environment for them to tolerate. So the goal of a return to learn plan is to participate in school without making the symptoms worse. And a return to learn plan will be fluid, and it's going to change as a student's symptoms decrease. And if they get worse, then you really need to revisit the plan. Now, every single teacher that works with that student needs to be informed of what the plan is so that the plan is consistent for the student and they know what to expect in every class. And it's really important that one key person be identified as the case manager. And that's going to be the go-to person for the parent, the student, and the teachers. So stage 1 is a rest stage. And this is a period of physical and cognitive rest, and it lasts for about 24 to 48 hours. And this is a period of time where their students are at home, there's no schoolwork, there's no homework, And in fact, even a lot of social activity is discouraged at this point. Stage 2 is still at home, kids still at home. They're doing light cognitive activity as tolerated. It might be light reading, maybe doing some puzzles and playing some games. It's even at this point where if a school organizes a hospital homebound teacher or tutor, the student can start to actually engage in cognitive activity or more academic activity, but the student is in control of their environment, how long they're actually participating in the activity, the intensity of the activity, and the pace. It also allows the student to have a lot of breaks as well. So before the student actually returns back to school, so stage 1 and stage 2 happen outside of school. Stage 3 is going to be when the student actually returns part-time. But before stage 3 happens, there needs to be a meeting at the school. And this is this collaborative planning where the student's symptoms are discussed, and then a plan is actually discussed around how long the student's going to be at school, what time of day, and what subjects they're actually going to be focusing on. And it's also this point where we talk about learning accommodations, and it needs to be maximum learning accommodations. So we want to start off with a lot of support, and then we're going to decrease the support. Now, a student would have to tolerate about 1 hour of cognitive activity in order to come back to school. Don't forget they have to get ready, they have to get out the door, perhaps walk or have a ride to school. That all takes cognitive effort. So what we want is 1 hour of cognitive activity. So we're going to be looking at a part-time program, no homework, no test taking, and no catching up and keeping up. We don't want the student pushing through their symptoms. We don't want teachers running after students going, hey, you missed this test last week or 2 weeks ago and you need to be actually writing the test at lunch. That doesn't work for these students. So no pushing through their symptoms. If kids are pushing through their symptoms, what we've learned is that the time frame for recovery could in fact slow down. So we don't want them in courses like PE, that's a safety issue. We don't want them in band. Band is much too noisy. And woodworking and metalwork could in fact be a safety issue, because these kids aren't processing very well. We often actually ask that there's learning support involved, where the student can actually go to the learning center for breaks and for extra assistance. Stage 4 happens when a student's tolerance has increased and their symptoms have decreased. And so we're still looking at part-time school, but we want them to be increasing their attendance, and we want to be reducing academic adaptations. So in stage 4, we're still not looking at standardized testing, and homework is limited, maybe 30 minutes a day. But again, it's about tolerance and it's really individualized. Stage 5 is where the student is actually back to full-time school. We're still decreasing learning accommodations, but you need to remember that full-time attendance does not equal full recovery. We still have some learning accommodations in place, and we'll be adding in some previously restricted classes like band and woodworking. But that all has to be assessed, and it's all done as tolerated. So the student is really key in the planning. Stage 6 is back to school full-time with no learning accommodations, regular expectations, taking tests, and returning to PE. But you cannot return to PE unless you have written medical clearance, and this is really important. The other thing that I need to mention is that through this process, it's really important to monitor a student's emotional health, because that can have a really big impact on their return to school. So there's lots to consider around return to school for a student with concussion. It takes lots of planning and lots of monitoring. And there's a number of really wonderful resources available to teachers and families. And one of them is the Teaching Kids with Concussion brochure that was done through the Ministry of Education. And another one is the Concussion Awareness Teaching Tool. And there's 3 parts to that. 2 have already been created, and the first one was for medical practitioners, the second one was for coaches and parents, and being developed right now and hopefully available in the spring of 2015 is a module for educators. And there's numerous online resources available as well. So there's lots of information, you may just have to look for it, and I hope this is helpful in terms of helping you return a student back to school with concussion.